October the 1st, 1943, 22,000 feet above the jagged limestone peaks of Indochina. The air inside the plexiglass top turret of the B-24 Liberator is thin, freezing, and vibrating violently. Outside, the sky is a deceptively calm canvas of blue. Inside, Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko is waiting. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines are roaring with a deafening mechanical scream, rattling the airframe enough to loosen teeth. But Benko's hands rest lightly on the spade grips of his twin 50 caliber machine guns. He is perfectly still. Most gunners in the formation are currently praying. They are praying for aim, praying for survival, and praying that their mass-produced weapons will not jam when the enemy fighters dive. Benko does not pray for his equipment. He trusts it absolutely. Sitting in the ammunition chutes beside him are belts of cartridges that he has personally de-linked, cleaned, weighed, and reassembled by hand. A tedious, obsession-driven ritual that his peers dismissed as a waste of time. They were wrong as the first glint of a Japanese fighter wing flashes in the distance. Benko is about to prove that in a war of industrial volume, precision is still the deadliest weapon of all. To understand why a technical sergeant would treat a 50 caliber cartridge with the delicacy of a watchmaker, one must first understand the desperate geography of 1943. Arthur Benko was not fighting in the industrialized skies over Germany, where formations of 1,000 bombers darkened the sun, supported by warm bases in England. He was fighting in the China-Burma-India theater, the CBI. To the men stationed there, CBI stood for confusion beyond imagination, or simply the end of the line. By the autumn of 1943, Imperial Japan had effectively strangled China. They held the eastern ports, the major rivers, and the railways. With the fall of Burma in 1942, the Burma Road, the last overland artery for Allied supplies, had been severed. China was an island of resistance, completely cut off by land and sea. The only way in and the only way out was the air. This reality created the most dangerous logistical pipeline in military history, the hump. To keep China in the war, American transport planes had to fly from Assam, India, over the eastern Himalayas, navigating through treacherous mountain passes, unpredictable monsoons, and Japanese interceptors. They called it the Aluminum Trail because the route was grimly marked by the glint of crashed C-46 and C-47 transport planes scattered across the jungle canopy and snow-capped peaks below. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every spare engine part, every tin of Spam, and every single bullet fired by the 14th Air Force had to be flown over these mountains. In this theater, waste was a cardinal sin. In Europe, if a gun jammed or a mission failed, it was a tactical error. In China, it was a logistical catastrophe. A single belt of ammunition represented dangerous hours of flight time by transport crews, risking their lives to deliver it. Commanding this starved force was Major General Claire Lee Chennault. The leather-faced tactician had already become a legend with the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, using P-40 Warhawks to bedevil the Japanese Air Force in the early days of the war. But by 1943, the AVG had been absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces as the 14th Air Force. Chennault was no longer just running a guerrilla air war. He was trying to break the Japanese stranglehold on the continent. To do that, he needed more than fighters. He needed a hammer. That hammer arrived in the form of the 308th Bombardment Group, the first heavy bomber unit deployed to China. Flying the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the 308th brought a new strategic capability to the table. Unlike the medium bombers that had operated in theater previously, the B-24 had the range to strike deep into Japanese occupied territory. hitting shipping lines in the South China Sea and major supply depots in Hankou and Haiphong. However, bringing heavy bombers into the CBI was a gamble. The B-24 was a complex four-engine beast that required immense maintenance. The runways in China were often built by hand, crushed into existence by hundreds of thousands of Chinese laborers pulling massive stone rollers. The dust from these crushed rock runways chewed up engines. The humidity rotted electrical wiring. And the isolation meant that replacement parts were almost non-existent. When the 308th touched down, they entered a war of extreme asymmetry. The Japanese Army Air Force in China was flown by veteran pilots flying highly maneuverable aircraft like the Ki-43 Oscar and the A-6M0. These pilots had spent years fighting over the Pacific and Asia. They knew the terrain, they held the initiative, and they outnumbered the Americans significantly. For the bomber crews of the 308th, survival depended entirely on the defensive box. A B-24 Liberator was designed to be a flying fortress, bristling with 1050 caliber machine guns. In theory, a formation of Liberators could throw up a wall of lead so dense that no fighter could penetrate it. But this theory relied on one critical assumption: that the guns would actually fire. In the dusty, humid conditions of China, this was a dangerous assumption to make. Factory standard ammunition was mass-produced in the United States, packed in crates, shipped across oceans, rattled on trains across India, and flown over the freezing Himalayas. By the time it reached a remote airfield in China, links were bent, casings were dented, and moisture had seeped into powder charges. It was not uncommon for a gunner to squeeze his triggers during a critical attack, feel the gun fire 3 rounds and then fall silent with a jammed feed. In the European theater, a jam meant you aborted the attack or relied on your wingman. In the isolated skies of the CBI, where a single B-24 might be separated from its formation by bad weather or engine trouble, a jammed gun was a death sentence. The Japanese pilots were experts at spotting a silent turret. They would stalk the bomber, waiting for the defensive fire to cease, and then slash in for the kill. This was the environment Arthur Benko walked into. A war where logistics dictated strategy, where the enemy was veteran and ruthless, and where mechanical reliability was the difference between returning to base or vanishing into the jungle. While most men cursed the supply lines and the faulty equipment, Benko looked at the problem differently. He realized that the greatest threat to the B-24 wasn't just the Japanese Zero, it was the American assembly line. The weapon Arthur Benko rode into battle was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. In the American press, it was celebrated as a marvel of modern engineering. Faster, and with a longer range than the famous B-17 Flying Fortress. But to the crews who flew it, the B-24 was a utilitarian beast. It was slab-sided, boxy, and difficult to fly in formation. It earned a grim nickname among the airmen, the Flying Coffin. The Liberator's greatest asset was the Davis wing, a thin, high-aspect ratio design that generated tremendous lift and reduced drag. This wing allowed the 308th Bomb Group to carry heavy payloads over the jagged Himalayas, where other planes would stall. But the Davis wing was also the plane's Achilles heel. It was fragile. If a B-24 took heavy damage to the wing spar, the wing didn't just lose lift. It often folded completely, sending the aircraft into a catastrophic, unrecoverable spin. Unlike the B-17, which could limp home with half a tail and 2 engines out, the B-24 was unforgiving. It required constant, aggressive defense to survive. Benko's station was the Martin 250 CE top turret, a glass bubble located just behind the cockpit. It was the nerve center of the bomber's defense. From this perch, Benko had a 360-degree view of the sky. He could see the entire formation, track incoming bandits from any clock position, and coordinate fire with the other gunners. But this visibility came at a price. The top turret gunner was the most exposed man on the ship. When Japanese fighters initiated a high side attack, diving from the sun to rake the bomber's fuselage, they were looking directly at Benko. The tactical reality of 1943 made the top turret critical. Japanese pilots in the CBI flying the nimble Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar had learned that the B-24 was vulnerable to frontal attacks. They would swing wide, climb high, and turn in for a head-on pass, closing at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. In these split-second encounters, the window to fire was razor-thin. A gunner had perhaps 2 seconds to track the target, calculate the lead, and fire a lethal burst before the enemy plane flashed past. If a gun jammed in those 2 seconds, there was no second chance. The enemy fighter would pour 12.7mm rounds into the cockpit, the engines, or the wing roots. The standard procedure for clearing a jam involved manually charging the weapon, hauling back on a heavy handle while fighting G-forces and adrenaline. It took time that the crew did not have. Most gunners accepted jamming as an inevitable hazard of war, a roll of the dice dictated by the quality of ammunition manufactured in St. Louis or Bridgeport. Arthur Benko, however, did not believe in dice. He looked at the standard issue ammunition belts, often covered in grit from the transport process, with unevenly seated projectiles and varying propellant loads, and saw a variable he could control. He realized that while he couldn't redesign the B-24 or change the Japanese tactics, he could ensure that when he pulled the triggers, his machine guns would function with the reliability of a Swiss watch. This realization set him on a collision course with military bureaucracy, and eventually led to one of the most remarkable individual performances of the war. To the casual observer on the airfield, Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko looked like a man wasting his time. While other airmen spent their precious downtime playing poker, sleeping off the humidity, or trading cigarettes for local liquor, Benko could be found sitting alone in the shade of a wing, surrounded by thousands of loose .50 caliber rounds. He wasn't just cleaning his guns, he was rebuilding his ammunition. Benko was not a typical draftee, hailing from the copper mining town of Bisbee, Arizona. He was a natural marksman long before the Army Air Forces put him in a turret. In the civilian world, he had been a competitive shooter. A man who understood that in precision shooting, a millimeter of variance at the muzzle becomes a miss of 3 feet at 500 yards. He knew that mass-produced military ammunition was built to a standard of good enough. In a factory, churning out millions of rounds a day, tolerances were loose. Some bullets were seated slightly crooked in the casing. Some had uneven powder charges. Others had burrs on the brass that could catch in a feed chute. For an infantryman with an M1 Garand, a bad round was an annoyance. For an aerial gunner, it was a catastrophe. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun fires at a rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute. It is a violent high-speed mechanical process where a belt of ammunition is ripped through the receiver, stripped, chambered, fired, and extracted in a fraction of a second. If a single link in the belt was bent, or if a single casing was slightly deformed, the gun would jam. Benko's stupid trick was a rejection of good enough. His process was exhaustive and mind-numbing. First, he would take the factory-issued belts of ammunition, often coated in sticky cosmoline preservative and grit from the transport trucks, and manually de-link them. He took every single cartridge apart from the belt. Then, he cleaned them. He wiped down every individual round, removing the factory grease and the dust of India. He inspected the brass casings for dents or scratches. He checked the primers to ensure they were seated correctly. He shook the rounds to listen to the powder, developing an almost supernatural sense for cartridges that didn't feel right. If a round was even marginally suspect, he tossed it into a reject pile. Once the rounds were perfect, he turned his attention to the links, the metal clips that hold the belt together. He checked them for flexibility and rust, discarding any that were stiff or bent. Only then would he painstakingly reassemble the belt, linking the rounds back together by hand. He didn't stop there. He meticulously calibrated the headspace and timing of his twin Brownings, adjusting the internal mechanics so they ran in perfect synchronization with his hand-selected ammo. He treated the heavy, brute force machine guns as if they were fine sporting rifles. His squadron mates in the 374th Bomb Squadron watched this ritual with a mix of amusement and confusion. To them, ammo was ammo. It came in a box, you loaded it, and you fired it. Spending hours scrubbing individual bullets seemed like a symptom of barbed wire sickness, the psychological toll of being in the field too long. They mocked him gently, calling him the Worrier, or asking if he intended to polish the bullets until they blinded the Japanese pilots. Benko ignored them. He knew something they didn't. He understood that in the chaos of aerial combat, where G-forces pinned you to your seat and adrenaline destroyed your fine motor skills, you could not rely on luck. You had to rely on physics, and physics favored the man who removed the variables. This obsession with mechanical perfection was about to collide with the brutal reality of Japanese tactics. The enemy pilots of the 14th Air Force were not the inexperienced rookies that Americans would face later in the war. They were the survivors of the early campaigns, and they had developed a specific lethal method for killing B-24s. To understand the magnitude of Benko's advantage, one must look through the eyes of the men trying to kill him. The Japanese Army Air Force pilots stationed in Indochina were not the desperate kamikazes of 1945. They were skilled, calculating predators. Flying the nimble Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, they possessed an aircraft that could outturn anything in the sky, but they respected the defensive fire of the American heavy bombers. They viewed a formation of B-24s as a flying porcupine. Approaching from the rear was suicide. The tail gunner and the ball turret gunner created a cone of fire that was nearly impenetrable. Approaching from the side exposed the fighter to the waist gunners and the top turret. But the veterans knew the B-24 had a blind spot, or at least a weak spot, the nose. The standard Japanese tactic against the Liberator was the 12 o'clock high attack. The fighter pilot would climb above the bomber formation, positioning himself directly in front of the American flight path. Then he would roll inverted and dive. The geometry of this attack was terrifying. The bomber was moving forward at 200 miles per hour. The fighter was diving at 300 miles per hour. The closing speed was nearly 500 miles per hour. For the American gunner, this created a nightmare scenario. The enemy aircraft started as a small dot, rapidly expanding into a screaming radial engine and flashing wings. In those fleeting seconds, the gunner had to track a target that was changing its angle of attack every millisecond. He had to calculate deflection, shooting not at where the plane was, but where it would be in half a second. Most gunners, fueled by panic and adrenaline, relied on volume. They would hold the triggers down, walking their tracers toward the enemy, hoping a wall of lead would force the fighter to break off. This spray and pray method had two fatal flaws. First, it heated the gun barrels rapidly, expanding the metal and causing friction. Second, it stressed the ammunition belt. If a factory standard round had a slightly protruding primer or a rough casing, the violent cycling of a long burst would almost certainly cause a stoppage. When a gun jammed during a frontal attack, the defensive box collapsed. The Japanese pilot, seeing the tracers stop, would press his attack to point-blank range, pouring cannon shells into the bomber's flight deck. Arthur Benko changed the math. Because his ammunition was hand-sorted and his guns were micrometer perfect, Benko didn't have to spray and pray. He didn't have to worry about overheating or jamming. He could fire short, disciplined, sniper-like bursts, but he could do so repeatedly, without hesitation. While other gunners were wrestling with charging handles, cursing their equipment, Benko was tracking. He treated the twin .50 calibers like a bolt-action rifle. He waited. He let the enemy close the distance. He watched the wings of the Kai-43 grow larger in his gun sight. He understood that the closer the enemy got, the deadlier he became, but only if his gun didn't fail. Benko's philosophy was about to be tested in the most extreme environment possible. As October 1943 progressed, the 308th Bomb Group was tasked with a series of deep penetration raids into occupied China and Vietnam. The targets were heavily defended. The Japanese fighter wings were on high alert. The sniper of the skies had his perfect bullets ready. Now he needed a target. October 1st, 1943. 12 Sunt p.m. The formation of B-24 Liberators from the 308th Bomb Group hangs suspended over the Gulf of Tonkin, turning inland toward the port city of Haiphong. The target is the vital power plant and warehouse district supplying the Japanese occupation forces. Inside the bomber named the Goon, commanded by Lieutenant Sam Skousen, the atmosphere is brittle with tension. They are flying at 22,000 feet. The outside air temperature is 30 degrees below zero. Frost encrusts the eyebrows of the waist gunners, and the condensation from their breath freezes instantly on their oxygen masks. For Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko in the top turret, this is the moment of truth. Intelligence reports had warned that the Japanese airfields around Haiphong were reinforced. They were right. As the heavy bombers lumber toward the drop zone, the radio crackles with the voice of the formation leader. Bandits. 3 o'clock high. Large formation. It is not just a patrol. It is a swarm. More than 30 Japanese fighters, a mix of Kai-43 Oscars and Mitsubishi Zeros, are climbing rapidly from the haze below. They are the 25th and 33rd Sentai, seasoned interceptor units, charged with defending the airspace over Indochina. They see the American bombers as slow, fat targets silhouetted against the bright sky. The Japanese pilots execute a classic coordination maneuver. They split into groups. One group climbs high to dive from the sun, while others hang back to pick off stragglers. They know the B-24's defensive patterns. They are looking for the weak link in the chain. The gunner who is slow, the turret that isn't moving, the gap in the wall of lead. Benko rotates his Martin turret. The electric motor whines smoothly. Through his reflector sight, he scans the attacking force. He doesn't just see enemy planes. He sees trajectory, speed, and angle. He checks his ammunition feed chutes one last time. The belts he spent hours cleaning, weighing, and linking are sitting ready. The first wave of Zeros commits. They dive from the 12 o'clock position, the dreaded frontal attack. They are coming straight for the nose of Skousen's aircraft. The closing speed is nearly 600 miles per hour. At this speed, a collision is seconds away. In a standard engagement, the top turret gunner would start firing now, wasting rounds at extreme range in a desperate attempt to scare the fighters off. The cockpit interphone is filled with shouted call-outs from other crew members, panic rising in their voices as the tracers from the Japanese fighters begin to sparkle past the fuselage. They're coming in. 12 o'clock. Break. Break. Benko says nothing. He holds his fire. He watches the lead Zero grow larger in the glass. He waits until he can see the engine cowling. He waits until the geometry is absolute. His discipline is terrifying. The enemy pilot, emboldened by the lack of return fire, holds his line thinking the turret is unmanned or jammed. He corrects his aim to rake the cockpit. It is a fatal miscalculation. At 600 yards, Benko squeezes the triggers. He does not slam them. He depresses them with the rhythmic precision of a typist. The twin 50 calibers roar, but only for a second. A short, controlled burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tears through the freezing air. Because the ammunition is hand-balanced, the trajectory is flat and true. The rounds do not scatter. They converge. The lead Zero flies directly into the stream of lead. The impact is catastrophic. The Japanese fighter shudders as the rounds smash into the engine block and the wing roots. There is no smoke, just a sudden, violent blossoming of fire. The Zero disintegrates, cartwheeling past the bomber's right wing, a ball of debris. Benko does not celebrate. He does not pause. He releases the triggers, pivots the turret, and acquires the wingman. The second Japanese pilot, seeing his leader vaporized, instinctively jerks his stick to roll away. It is a fatal hesitation. Benko tracks the maneuver. The stupid ammunition feeds through the chutes without a hitch. No bent links. No protruding primers. The guns cycle smoothly, hungry for more. Benko fires a second burst. The wingman's fuel tank catches the incendiary rounds. The plane explodes. 2 kills in 10 seconds. The intercom on the goon erupts with disbelief, but the fight is not over. The main body of the Japanese squadron is now swarming the formation. They are attacking from all angles. 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock high. For the next 20 minutes, the sky over Haiphong becomes a chaotic, swirling dogfight. But inside the top turret, there is no chaos. There is only rhythm, acquire, track, fire, kill. A Kai-43 dives from the right. Benko spins the turret, fighting the G-forces of the bomber's evasive maneuvers. He fires. Smoke trails from the fighter's cowling. It spins down into the cloud deck. Another fighter attempts a belly attack. Benko depresses the guns to their lowest limit, catching the enemy as he zooms upward. The rounds shear off the tail section. In a standard engagement, a top turret gunner would be fighting his weapon by now. The heat would cause expansion. The dirty ammo would cause a failure to extract. The gunner would be frantically racking the charging handles, screaming for cover. Benko's guns never stop. The brass casings rain down into the fuselage in a steady, metallic torrent, piling up around his feet. The smell of cordite fills the turret, acrid and sharp. He is a machine aimed by a man. By the time the Japanese fighters finally break off, low on fuel and ammunition, the sky behind the goon is empty. The crew does a damage check. They are riddled with holes, but they are flying. Then the voice of the tail gunner comes over the interphone, trembling slightly. He has been watching the show from the rear. He starts counting the smoke plumes trailing down to the jungle floor. 1, 2, 3. He keeps counting on this single mission in the span of one extended engagement. Arthur Benko has not just defended his ship. He has decimated a squadron. The final tally, verified by multiple witnesses in the formation, is staggering. 7 confirmed kills. It is a number that defies statistical probability. Most gunners go an entire war without a single confirmed kill. Benko has downed an entire flight of enemy aircraft in one afternoon. And he did it because while the enemy was relying on bravery, Arthur Benko was relying on the relentless, jam-free perfection of his hand-loaded belts. When the wheels of the Goon touched down on the crushed rock runway at the forward base in China, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the profound exhaustion of high-altitude combat. The propellers sputtered to a halt. The silence that followed was heavy. Usually, post-mission debriefings were routine affairs. Pilots reporting flak concentrations. Navigators checking coordinates. This time, the debriefing room was electric. Intelligence officers of the 14th Air Force listened in stunned silence as the crew of Lieutenant Skozen's bomber recounted the engagement. Then they brought in the witnesses, crews from the other Liberators, flying in the formation. The reports were cross-referenced. The geometry of the falling planes was mapped out. The skepticism of the command staff was high. In the confusion of an air battle, claims were often exaggerated. 2 gunners might shoot at the same plane and both claim the kill. But as the witness statements piled up, the picture became undeniable. The Japanese interceptors hadn't just been repelled. They had been systematically dismantled. The final official tally for Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko on that single mission stood at 7 confirmed kills. It was a staggering number. To put it in perspective, an American fighter pilot became an ace after 5 kills, usually accumulated over months of combat. Benko had surpassed that threshold in 20 minutes, firing from a vibrating glass bubble. News of the feat rippled through the China-Burma-India theater. General Chennault, a man who rarely handed out praise, took notice. The stupid ammo trick was no longer a joke. It was a revelation. The ground crews and other gunners who had once mocked Benko's tedious cleaning ritual now looked at his pile of discarded factory rounds with new understanding. They realized that while they had been playing the odds, Benko had been rigging the game. His turret hadn't jammed once. Every time he pulled the trigger, death came out. The psychological impact was immediate. For the crews of the 308th, Benko became a talisman. Flying in formation near the Goon was considered an insurance policy. For the Japanese, the morale blow was severe. They had lost some of their best pilots to a single bomber. The legend of the American gunner who couldn't miss began to circulate, adding a new layer of fear to the already dangerous intercept missions. But in the cruel logic of war, accolades do not stop bullets. Benko had survived the impossible, but his tour of duty was drawing to a close. The Air Force prepared to send their deadliest gunner home, not just as a hero, but as an instructor. A man who could teach a new generation that the difference between life and death was a clean grain of gunpowder. By the end of his tour in late 1943, Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko had officially credited with 16 confirmed kills. This number made him the top-scoring aerial gunner of the 14th Air Force, and by many accounts, the deadliest turret gunner in the entire United States Army Air Forces. He had faced the best pilots of the Japanese Empire, and defeated them with a combination of patience and hand-polished brass. His success forced a quiet reckoning within the gunnery schools. While the Army could not officially mandate that every gunner spend 6 hours a day disassembling ammunition, the logistics were simply impossible on a global scale. Benko's legend served as a brutal lesson. It proved that the random jamming of the M2 Browning was not an act of God, but a failure of preparation. He had taken the variables of mass production and smoothed them out with human will. In November 1943, the order finally came down. Benko, along with his pilot Sam Skousen, had done their part. They had survived the hump, the monsoons, and the zeros. They were to rotate back to the United States to train new crews. They packed their bags, leaving behind the war-torn airfields of China for the safety of home. They boarded a transport plane, not a bomber, but a simple ferry flight, destined for the first leg of the long journey back to America. They never made it. In a twist of fate that defies narrative logic, the transport plane carrying the deadliest gunner in the Pacific crashed near the China-Burma border. There were no enemy fighters, no flak, no heroic last stand. It was likely a mechanical failure or a pilot error in the unforgiving weather of the hump. Arthur Benko, the man who had obsessively controlled every single mechanical variable of his war, was killed by a machine he could not touch. He died not in the turret where he was a master, but as a passenger in the dark. The wreckage was located, but the man who had perfected the art of aerial survival was gone. He left behind a record that was never broken, and a lesson that every mechanic and gunner in the theater understood in their bones. In a war of machines, the only thing that saves you is how well you know them. War is almost always quantified by scale. We measure it in gross tonnage, in industrial output, and in the movement of armies, numbering in the millions. We tend to view the individual soldier as a statistic, a standardized component in a vast grinding machine. But the story of Arthur Benko shatters that illusion. It serves as a stark reminder that even in a conflict decided by mass production, there is no substitute for individual craftsmanship. Benko's stupid trick was, in reality, a quiet rebellion against mediocrity. In a theater defined by scarcity and neglect, where equipment was expected to fail and men were expected to die because of it, he refused to accept the statistical inevitability of a jammed gun. He understood that the difference between survival and destruction often comes down to the invisible margins. A burr on a brass casing, a missing grain of gunpowder, a fraction of a millimeter. His legacy is not merely the 16 aircraft he destroyed, nor the squadron he single-handedly dismantled over Haiphong. His true legacy lies in the demonstration that mastery is a choice. While others waited for the war to happen to them, hoping their equipment would hold together, Benko took ownership of the only variables he could control. He turned a crude instrument of suppression into a tool of absolute precision. Today, the wreckage of the transport plane that carried him to his death has long since been reclaimed by the jungles and snows of the Himalayas. The aluminum has corroded. The names on the manifest have faded into the deep archives of the Air Force, but the lesson remains vibrant. In the chaotic noise of combat, where luck seems to reign supreme, Arthur Benko proved that you can make your own luck. He showed that the most dangerous weapon in the Pacific was not the plane, or the bomb, or even the machine gun. It was the man who cared enough to make it work,